Most of us learn a straightforward story about 1865. The Civil War ends, Lincoln's efforts succeed, and the 13th Amendment guarantees the abolition of slavery. But reading the actual text of the amendment reveals a different reality. Buried right in Section 1 is a highly specific caveat. The legal guarantee of freedom ends with a comma, followed by 14 precise words. Except as a punishment for crime, whereof the party shall have been duly convicted. Immediately following the war, Southern state governments were completely bankrupt. Their railroads, bridges, and industrial centers were reduced to rubble. For decades, the region's entire financial model relied entirely on an enslaved, unpaid workforce. Emancipation eliminated that labor force overnight, leaving an immediate, massive economic void. Southern lawmakers faced an immediate logistical hurdle. They needed a legal mechanism to force thousands of people back into the fields and mines to rebuild their infrastructure, and they had to do it without violating the brand new 13th Amendment. In late 1865, state legislatures rolled out a surgical legal strategy known as the Black Codes. These new statutes were engineered directly to ensnare the newly freed Black population. States like Mississippi and South Carolina passed sweeping legislation that criminalized everyday life. If you were a Black person over the age of 18 and lacked formal employment, you could be arrested for the criminal act of vagrancy. Mundane activities suddenly carried severe prison sentences. You could be arrested for walking on the grass or quitting a job before a contract ended. To work as a mechanic or a shopkeeper, a Black citizen had to purchase a highly expensive, specialized license from a district judge. Without the license, you couldn't legally work. Without work, you were simply a vagrant. The volume of arrests was driven by the county fee system. Local sheriffs and deputies were not paid a traditional salary. Instead, their take-home pay was tied directly to the fees they collected from serving warrants and making arrests, giving law enforcement a direct financial incentive to round up as many Black men as possible. Local judges were also paid per conviction. Working in tandem with law enforcement, a single judge could process and rubber stamp 50 vagrancy charges in a single afternoon. This highly lucrative assembly line successfully pulled thousands of innocent citizens into the justice system. Once the gavel fell, the newly freed citizens were legally transformed into the duly convicted criminals required to trigger the 13th Amendment loophole. This chart shows the Alabama state penitentiary demographics before the Civil War. Because enslaved people were disciplined privately, the prison was 99% white. Following the Black Codes, the system experienced a demographic shock, flipping to 90% Black in a single decade. Because state governments could not afford to house or feed these thousands of new inmates, they turned to monetizing them. Through the convict lease system, states rented human beings out to private corporations, like United States Steel and the Tennessee Coal, Iron, and Railroad Company. This visualization weighs the lethal economic math of the era. Before the war, an enslaver had tens of thousands of modern dollars heavily invested in the purchase of a human being. That financial investment provided an economic incentive to keep the worker alive. Under convict leasing, a private coal company paid the state as little as $9 a month. The corporation had absolutely zero capital invested in the long-term survival of the worker. If a leased worker died from malnutrition, contaminated drinking water, or a collapsed mine shaft, the company lost no equity. They simply sent a telegraph to the warden requesting another prisoner. This total lack of liability resulted in horrifying mortality rates, with operations like the Coalburg mine recording 90 deaths for every 1,000 men. State governments effectively functioned as completely unregulated temp agencies. They generated limitless, unencumbered profit from unpaid labor, while driving free laborers into extreme poverty, because they could not compete with a disposable workforce. By the early 1900s, progressive-era journalism and memoirs detailing the conditions inside the camps brought national shame to the South. The overwhelming public pressure made it politically impossible for states to continue leasing prisoners to private coal mines. But the state governments did not abandon forced labor. They simply adapted the mechanism. Instead of renting men to private corporations, the state kept the prisoners to work on public projects, morphing the lease system into the chain gang. The physical location shifted from underground mines to open-air work sites, but the economic extraction remained identical. These highly organized legal forms of forced labor built local roads, cleared new railways, and laid foundational infrastructure, and they were not effectively dismantled by the federal government until the onset of World War II. This century of targeted criminalization laid the physical and legal architecture for Jim Crow segregation. By engineering a system that equated Black life with criminality, states codified racial disparities that continue to run deep within the modern justice system. The legal doctrine that allowed this to happen is still active. As recently as 2010, a federal court ruled that under the Constitution, prisoners still have no enforceable right to be paid for their labor. The failure of Reconstruction was a highly organized legal strategy. The next time you travel down a historic Southern road or pass an old railway line, look closely at the ground. The ghosts of the 13th Amendment's loophole are paved into the very infrastructure of the modern world.